It was August 3rd, 1943. The forests of Belarus had become a ghost world where entire villages vanished overnight and supply trains exploded without warning. Wehrmacht logistics officers stared at maps covered in red marks, each one representing a destroyed section of railway track. The marks multiplied every night. The German war machine, which had conquered half of Europe through speed and coordination, was grinding to a halt. And the enemy responsible wasn't the Red Army. It was something far more terrifying: ordinary people who had learned to turn infrastructure into weapons. The Geneva Conventions of 1929 had established clear rules for warfare. Uniformed soldiers fought uniformed soldiers on defined battlefields. Civilians remained neutral or faced execution as unlawful combatants. Guerrilla warfare, sabotage behind enemy lines, and attacks on supply infrastructure were banned under international law. Nations that violated these rules faced diplomatic consequences and potential war crimes tribunals. The Soviet Union had signed these conventions. But in 1941, when German armies swept across Soviet territory, capturing millions of soldiers and murdering civilians by the hundreds of thousands, the rules became irrelevant. Survival demanded methods that civilized nations had agreed to prohibit. The partisan movement began spontaneously in summer 1941. Red Army soldiers cut off during the German advance melted into forests rather than surrendering. Civilians whose villages were burned formed armed bands. By winter, thousands of these groups operated behind German lines, conducting hit-and-run attacks that Wehrmacht commanders dismissed as insignificant nuisances. The partisans were poorly armed, with hunting rifles and captured German weapons. They had no coordination between groups, no strategic objectives, and no support from Moscow. They were an irritation, not a threat. This changed in May 1942, when the Soviet High Command created the central headquarters of the partisan movement. For the first time, Moscow began coordinating guerrilla operations behind enemy lines. Stalin appointed Panteleimon Ponomarenko, a ruthless political officer, to command the organization. Ponomarenko understood that partisan warfare wasn't about honor or following rules. It was about inflicting maximum damage with minimum resources. He needed a strategy that would cripple German operations without requiring conventional military forces. The answer was obvious once someone bothered to look at a map. Germany's conquest of the Soviet Union depended entirely on railways. We'll pause briefly before continuing. If stories like this are important to you, please consider supporting the video with a like and a subscription. After watching, a short comment, even a simple one, helps these stories reach further. Your support ensures they are not forgotten. Thank you. Let's continue. The German logistics system was a masterpiece of industrial efficiency. Every division at the front required 500 tons of supplies per day: ammunition, fuel, food, medical supplies, and replacement equipment. These materials travelled thousands of kilometres from German factories to the Eastern Front. The entire system depended on railways because roads in the Soviet Union were primitive dirt tracks that became impassable mud seas during spring and fall. Without functioning railways, the Wehrmacht would starve. Ponomarenko realized that partisans didn't need to defeat German armies in battle. They just needed to cut the railways faster than Germans could repair them. But there was a problem that seemed insurmountable. The German railway system in occupied Soviet territory stretched over 60,000 kilometers. It employed tens of thousands of workers and was defended by dedicated security battalions, armoured trains, and air patrols. How could poorly armed partisan bands, operating without heavy equipment or explosives manufacturing, possibly inflict meaningful damage on such a massive system? The answer came from an unlikely source: a former railway engineer named Ilya Starinov, who had been experimenting with railway sabotage techniques since the 1930s. Starinov was a legend in Soviet military intelligence. He had pioneered demolition techniques during the Spanish Civil War, training Republican forces in sabotage methods. When Germany invaded, he was teaching at a military academy. The NKVD pulled him from his position and sent him to Belarus to train partisan units. What Starinov understood, and what most military planners missed, was that destroying railways didn't require sophisticated explosives. It just required knowledge of where railways were vulnerable and how to exploit those vulnerabilities with improvised materials. The key insight was elegantly simple. A railway track consists of steel rails bolted to wooden ties that rest on a gravel bed. The rails themselves are incredibly strong, designed to support locomotives weighing hundreds of tons. But the connection points where rail sections join together are vulnerable. These joints are held by steel plates called fish plates, secured with bolts. If you removed those bolts, the rail sections would separate. When a locomotive passed over the gap at speed, the weight would drive the rail ends into the gravel bed, derailing the entire train. No explosives required, just a wrench. But Starinov didn't stop with bolt removal. He taught partisans to place small explosive charges under the rail joints, timed to detonate when trains passed overhead. The charges didn't need to be large. A few kilograms of TNT placed precisely would shatter the joint and guarantee derailment. Even better, partisans could manufacture their own explosives from agricultural chemicals. Ammonium nitrate fertilizer, common on collective farms, could be processed into a crude but effective explosive. Diesel fuel served as a sensitizer. With materials available in any rural area, partisans could produce hundreds of kilograms of homemade explosives. The training program began in earnest in early 1943. Starinov and his team moved between partisan camps, teaching demolition techniques to groups that often had little formal education. Many partisans were peasants who had never seen a blueprint or chemical formula. But Starinov's methods were deliberately simple. He demonstrated each technique practically, showing exactly where to place charges, how to wire detonators, and how to retreat safely after the attack. He emphasized that partisan sabotage wasn't about heroism. It was about efficiency. Hit the target, escape unseen, and survive to hit another target tomorrow. The psychological preparation was as important as technical training. Many partisans initially resisted attacking railways because trains often carried Soviet civilians being deported to forced labor camps in Germany. Derailing these trains meant potentially killing their own people. Starinov's response was brutal but logical. Every train that reached the front delivered ammunition that German soldiers would use to kill Red Army troops. Every tanker car of fuel powered German tanks. The partisan war was about choosing between bad options and worse ones. Saving a few civilians by allowing military supplies to reach the front would cost thousands of Soviet lives in future battles. The other psychological barrier was fear of reprisals. German policy toward partisans was clear and horrifying. Any civilian suspected of aiding guerrillas faced immediate execution. Villages near partisan activity were burned. Hostages were hanged in public squares as warnings. Wehrmacht commanders posted notices promising that for every German soldier killed by partisans, 50 Soviet civilians would die. These weren't empty threats. German reprisal units murdered tens of thousands of civilians throughout occupied territories. Partisans who conducted sabotage knew they were signing death warrants for their neighbours. But by 1943, the calculus had shifted. German occupation policies were so brutal that civilians faced death regardless of partisan activity. Villages were burned for failing to meet food requisition quotas. Civilians were rounded up for slave labour whether they helped partisans or not. The choice wasn't between safety and danger. It was between dying passively or fighting back with a chance of inflicting damage on the occupiers. This grim logic drove recruitment. Partisan bands that had numbered dozens in 1941 grew to hundreds, then thousands. By summer 1943, partisan forces in Belarus alone exceeded 300,000 fighters. Moscow recognized that this was the moment to launch a coordinated campaign. Ponomarenko proposed Operation Rail War, the simultaneous destruction of railway infrastructure across the entire German rear area. The plan was audacious to the point of insanity. Partisan units would attack railways on the same night, hitting thousands of locations simultaneously. The goal wasn't just to disrupt German logistics, but to create a catastrophic systemic failure. Repair crews would be overwhelmed. Security forces would be spread impossibly thin. The psychological impact of losing control over such a vast area would shake German confidence. Stalin approved the operation in July 1943. The date was set for the night of August 3rd, coordinated to support the Red Army's counter-offensive after the Battle of Kursk. The plan called for destroying 10,000 separate locations along German supply routes. Each partisan unit received specific targets and precise timing instructions. They were told to use simultaneous attacks to maximize confusion and minimize the chance of German reinforcements arriving in time to prevent sabotage. The scope was unprecedented in military history. Never before had guerrilla forces attempted coordinated action on such a scale. The challenges of coordination were enormous. Partisan units operated deep in forests, often without radio communication. Many groups had no direct contact with Moscow and received orders through courier networks that could take weeks to traverse occupied territory. The timing had to be synchronized across thousands of kilometers, involving hundreds of separate partisan brigades that had never worked together. Soviet intelligence used every available method: radio broadcasts on predetermined frequencies, coded messages dropped by aircraft, and human couriers who memorized orders and traveled on foot through enemy territory. The preparation phase revealed the magnitude of partisan capabilities. Intelligence officers mapped every railway line in occupied territory, identifying vulnerable points: bridges, tunnels, major junctions, and isolated sections far from German security posts. They calculated that cutting these specific points would require approximately 40,000 individual demolition charges. The explosive requirements exceeded 1,000 tons. Manufacturing and distributing this quantity of explosives in occupied territory under German noses seemed impossible. But Starinov's training program had created a decentralized production network. Every partisan brigade had teams producing homemade explosives from agricultural chemicals. The detonators presented a different challenge. Electrical detonators required copper wire, batteries, and basic circuit knowledge. Many partisan units lacked these materials and technical expertise. Starinov's solution was elegant: timer-based mechanical detonators that could be built from watch parts. Clockwork mechanisms would trigger spring-loaded strikers that ignited percussion caps. These devices could be set hours in advance, allowing partisans to plant charges and withdraw to safety before detonation. The timers were crude but adequate for railway sabotage, where precise timing mattered less than simultaneous action across wide areas. German intelligence detected signs of unusual partisan activity in late July. Radio intercepts suggested increased coordination between groups. Interrogations of captured partisans revealed references to a major operation, though specifics remained vague. Wehrmacht security forces increased railway patrols, posted additional guards at bridges and tunnels, and conducted sweeps through forests near rail lines. But the occupied territory was simply too vast. German forces numbered only about 200,000 security troops to cover an area larger than France and Germany combined. They couldn't be everywhere. The night of August 3rd arrived with a summer thunderstorm rolling across Belarus. The weather was perfect for partisan operations. Rain muffled sound and reduced visibility for German sentries. Lightning flashes masked the brief illumination from partisan lanterns. In hundreds of forest camps, partisan units moved out at dusk, carrying charges, detonators, and weapons for covering their demolition teams. They travelled on foot through terrain they knew intimately, avoiding roads and German positions, converging on their assigned targets. The attacks began simultaneously at 01:30 hours on August 4th. Across thousands of kilometres, explosions shattered the night. Railway bridges collapsed into rivers. Rails were torn from their beds by massive detonation forces. Junction switches were destroyed by shaped charges that shredded the delicate mechanisms. Signal stations burned. Telegraph lines were cut. In some locations, partisans used axes and crowbars, physically tearing up rails when explosives were unavailable. The scale of destruction was biblical. In a single night, partisan forces destroyed or damaged over 10,000 separate sections of railway track. German reaction was confusion compounded by panic. Railway security forces found themselves under simultaneous attack across their entire defensive network. Radio communications jammed as every unit tried to report incidents at once. Armoured trains rushed to threaten locations only to find that tracks ahead had already been destroyed. Wehrmacht security battalions deployed to restore order but lacked the engineering equipment necessary to repair damaged infrastructure. By dawn on August 4th, German logistics officers realised they faced a catastrophe. The railway network that supported the entire Eastern Front had been crippled in 6 hours. The immediate impact on German military operations was devastating. Ammunition shipments stopped. Fuel tankers sat idle on undamaged sections of track, unable to reach their destinations. Hospital trains full of wounded soldiers couldn't evacuate to rear area medical facilities. Troop trains carrying reinforcements were stranded hundreds of kilometres from the front. Wehrmacht commanders at the front lines began rationing ammunition within 48 hours. Artillery batteries that had fired thousands of shells per day were limited to 50 rounds. Tank units couldn't refuel. The German war machine began cannibalizing itself, pulling supplies from less threatened sectors to feed units in critical positions. The repair effort revealed the true genius of rail war's design. German railway engineers needed an average of 12 hours to repair a single damaged rail section, assuming they had materials and equipment immediately available. 10,000 damaged sections meant 120,000 man-hours of labour. Germany didn't have enough railway engineers in the entire occupied Soviet Union to complete repairs in less than several weeks. They diverted construction battalions from other projects, pulled mechanics from tank repair shops, and even conscripted Soviet civilians at gunpoint to work on repairs. But the moment they fixed one section, partisans would attack another newly repaired segment. The psychological impact on German forces was profound. Security troops developed acute paranoia, seeing partisans everywhere. Every forest was a threat. Every peasant was a potential saboteur. The stress of constant vulnerability, never knowing when or where the next attack would occur, eroded morale catastrophically. German soldiers stationed in rear area security positions began requesting transfers to the front lines because combat seemed less terrifying than partisan warfare. At least on the front you could see the enemy. Partisans were invisible until the moment they struck. Wehrmacht commanders tried increasingly desperate countermeasures. They established fortified posts at major rail bridges and junctions, garrisoned by battalion-strength forces with artillery support. They deployed armoured trains equipped with searchlights and automatic weapons to patrol rail lines. They conducted massive sweeps through partisan-controlled forests, burning villages and executing anyone suspected of guerrilla connections. These operations killed thousands of civilians but barely dented partisan capabilities. For every partisan killed, 2 more civilians joined the resistance, radicalized by German brutality. The German reprisal policy backfired spectacularly. When Wehrmacht security forces burned villages near sabotage sites, they eliminated their own intelligence networks. The civilians who might have reported partisan movements now had nothing left to lose and every reason to support the guerrillas. German commanders created a self-fulfilling prophecy. Their brutal response to partisan activity drove neutral civilians into active resistance, which required even more brutal responses, which drove even more civilians into resistance. The cycle spiraled beyond German control. Soviet intelligence exploited German paranoia with calculated psychological warfare. They dropped leaflets near railway stations claiming that thousands more partisans were being trained and equipped. Radio broadcasts in German warned that railway workers collaborating with occupation authorities would be marked for execution. False intelligence was deliberately leaked, suggesting that partisan forces had received heavy weapons from Moscow. None of this was true in August 1943, but German commanders believed it because it confirmed their worst fears. The enemy they faced seemed to be growing stronger while they grew weaker. The second wave of rail war operations launched on August 25th, targeting the partially repaired railway network. This time, partisan units focused on destroying repair equipment and killing German railway engineers. They ambushed repair trains, dynamited tool depots, and assassinated senior engineers coordinating reconstruction efforts. The message was clear. Germany could repair the railways, but partisan forces would make that repair work prohibitively expensive in blood and resources. The calculation was coldly rational. Every German engineer killed was one fewer person capable of maintaining the logistics system. By September 1943, German logistics in the occupied Soviet Union had collapsed into permanent crisis. Trains that once ran on precise schedules now crawled along tracks at walking speed, with security troops inspecting every metre of rail before allowing locomotives to proceed. Journey times tripled. A supply train that previously took 3 days to travel from Poland to the front now required 9 days, if it arrived at all. Wehrmacht divisions at the front went on half rations. Tank battalions were immobilized by fuel shortages. Artillery units husbanded their shells like misers, firing only when absolutely necessary. The strategic impact became clear during the Soviet autumn offensive. Red Army forces launched attacks against German positions that were undersupplied and unable to maneuver due to fuel shortages. German commanders requested reinforcements that existed on paper but couldn't reach the front because railways were destroyed. Wehrmacht units that might have conducted fighting withdrawals to prepare defensive positions were instead surrounded and destroyed because they lacked the fuel to retreat. The Soviet advance that autumn exceeded all expectations, liberating vast territories and destroying entire German army groups. German High Command finally grasped the magnitude of the partisan threat in October 1943. Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the Wehrmacht High Command, issued a directive acknowledging that partisan warfare posed an existential threat to German military operations in the East. The directive ordered massive reinforcements for rear area security and authorized the most extreme countermeasures against civilian populations. But the directive was fundamentally obsolete before it was written. By October 1943, partisan forces controlled large sections of Belarus completely. German authority extended only as far as their armed columns could reach, and those columns couldn't reach very far when railways were constantly destroyed. The third wave of rail war launched in September 1943 and continued through early 1944. This phase was more sophisticated than the initial attacks. Partisans had learned from German countermeasures and adapted their tactics. Instead of massive simultaneous attacks, they conducted rolling campaigns that kept German repair crews constantly off balance. They hit newly repaired sections before German security forces could establish permanent defences. They targeted the repair equipment itself, understanding that destroying a rail-mounted crane was more valuable than destroying another section of track. They mined approach roads to repair sites, killing German engineers before they could begin work. The human cost of rail war was staggering on all sides. Partisan casualties were enormous. German security forces killed an estimated 50,000 partisan fighters during 1943. Civilians caught between partisan operations and German reprisals died in far greater numbers, possibly exceeding 100,000. German losses were also severe. Wehrmacht security battalions suffered casualty rates comparable to frontline combat units. Railway workers, both German and conscripted Soviet civilians, died by the thousands from partisan attacks and accidents caused by hasty, inadequate repairs. But the strategic exchange favoured the Soviet side overwhelmingly. Every German soldier tied down in rear area security duties was one fewer soldier available for combat at the front. Every ton of supplies that never reached frontline units weakened German combat effectiveness. The partisan campaign achieved strategic effects far exceeding what conventional military operations could accomplish with equivalent resources. A partisan brigade of 1,000 fighters, equipped with small arms and homemade explosives, could paralyze German logistics across a sector that would require an entire German division to secure. Individual stories from rail war reveal the human dimension behind the statistics. Klavdia Shulzhenko was a 19-year-old schoolteacher from a village near Minsk. German forces burned her village in retaliation for partisan activity in autumn 1942. Her parents and younger brother were killed. Klavdia escaped to the forests and joined a partisan brigade. She had no military training and had never handled explosives, but she learned quickly because the alternative was death or collaboration. By summer 1943, she was leading demolition teams on rail sabotage missions. Klavdia's team specialized in bridge attacks. Bridges were priority targets because they were difficult to repair and impossible to circumvent. A destroyed bridge forced Germans to detour rail traffic across vast distances or undertake lengthy reconstruction. Klavdia's unit destroyed 7 bridges during rail war operations. Her technique was brutally effective. Small charges placed on support piers would weaken the structure without immediate collapse. When a train crossed the damaged bridge, its weight would complete the destruction, sending the entire train into the river below. She survived the war and lived until 1997, spending her later years teaching children in the same school where she had worked before the war. The psychological transformation of civilians into partisans tells us much about the nature of partisan warfare. Klavdia was not a natural warrior. She was a schoolteacher who loved literature and wanted to live quietly. German occupation policies transformed her into a saboteur who could calculate explosive charges and time detonations to maximize casualties. This transformation occurred across hundreds of thousands of Soviet civilians. The occupation created its own resistance through policies so brutal that survival and resistance became synonymous. German soldiers' letters home from late 1943 reveal their growing despair about the partisan situation. One letter, intercepted by Soviet intelligence, describes the writer's assignment to railway security duties in Belarus. He writes about the constant fear of partisan attacks, the impossibility of distinguishing hostile civilians from neutral ones, and his certainty that he would never leave the East alive. The letter ends with a request that his family pray for his soul because he knew he was damned, not for military defeat, but for the atrocities his unit had committed against civilians in reprisal operations. These weren't confessions to war crimes. They were recognitions that the war in the East had become something beyond ordinary warfare, a descent into barbarism that left no one unchanged. The technological innovations developed during rail war influenced post-war guerrilla movements worldwide. Starinov's demolition techniques were studied by resistance movements from Vietnam to Afghanistan. The concept of using coordinated infrastructure attacks to paralyze a superior military force became a standard guerrilla warfare doctrine. The improvised explosive techniques, adapted from agricultural chemicals, were refined and improved. Every insurgency from the 1950s onward benefited from lessons learned in the forests of Belarus. But the most important lesson of rail war was strategic rather than technical. The operation demonstrated that guerrilla forces operating with clear objectives and centralized coordination could achieve strategic effects previously thought to require conventional military power. Partisan bands armed with rifles and homemade explosives crippled the logistics system of one of the most advanced military machines in history. They did this not through heroic charges or pitched battles, but through patient, systematic destruction of infrastructure that the enemy needed to sustain operations. The Geneva Convention's prohibition on guerrilla warfare was supposed to prevent the chaos and civilian casualties that partisan operations inevitably produce. Rail war proved that in total war, legal conventions become meaningless. When a nation faces existential threat, survival overrides law. The Soviet Union chose to violate international conventions because the alternative was Nazi occupation, which meant slavery and genocide for millions. The choice was between death following rules and survival through any means necessary. Stalin and his commanders chose survival. The moral calculus remains controversial. Rail war operations deliberately exposed civilians to German reprisals. Soviet commanders knew that every rail attack would trigger massacres of nearby villages. They accepted this consequence as necessary for strategic victory. Partisan operatives who planted charges on railway lines knew they were signing death warrants for civilians who lived near the tracks. They proceeded anyway because allowing German logistics to function unimpeded would cost even more Soviet lives in the long run. This was the arithmetic of atrocity, choosing between different categories of death. German commanders faced their own moral choices and generally made worse ones. Their reprisal policies didn't distinguish between active resistors and neutral civilians. Children were hanged alongside adults. Villages were burned on suspicion rather than evidence. These policies were war crimes by any definition, violations not only of Geneva Conventions but of basic human decency. The fact that partisans violated laws of war does not excuse German atrocities in response. Two wrongs don't create a right. They created a spiral of violence that consumed hundreds of thousands of lives. The final accounting of rail war's effectiveness came in early 1944, when Germany's eastern logistics system suffered complete systemic failure. Wehrmacht units at the front received less than 40% of their required supplies. Divisions were disbanded because they couldn't be sustained. Tank battalions sat idle for lack of fuel. Artillery fell silent for want of shells. The German retreat that began after Kursk accelerated into a rout during the winter offensive of 1943-44. The Red Army advanced hundreds of kilometers, liberating vast territories. Rail war didn't win the Eastern Front alone, but it created the conditions that made German defeat inevitable. Soviet partisan movement headquarters claimed destruction of over 40,000 railway demolitions during 1943 to 44, including 165 locomotives, thousands of rail cars, and hundreds of bridges. German records, though incomplete, generally confirm the scope of destruction. Wehrmacht logistics reports from late 1943 describe the railway system as functionally inoperative across large sections of occupied territory. These weren't propaganda claims. They were desperate assessments by officers trying to explain why supplies weren't reaching the front. The human cost defies precise calculation. Estimates suggest that partisan operations killed approximately 35,000 German military personnel during the war, with railway security forces suffering disproportionately high casualties. Civilian deaths from German reprisals probably exceeded 200,000. Partisan casualties were at least 150,000 killed. These numbers are conservative estimates. The true toll was likely much higher, lost in the chaos of total war where records were destroyed and entire villages vanished without trace. What made rail war shocking to Wehrmacht commanders wasn't just the scale of destruction. It was the demonstration that civilian populations could be mobilized into effective military forces that conventional armies couldn't defeat. German doctrine assumed that superior training, equipment, and tactics would always prevail over irregular forces. Rail war proved this assumption catastrophically wrong. Poorly armed civilians with basic demolition training could inflict strategic damage exceeding what bomber squadrons achieved. The Railway War demonstrated that in modern conflict, the distinction between military and civilian spheres was obsolete. Total war meant total participation, and any resource could become a weapon. The forests of Belarus, where rail war was fought, are peaceful now. The rail lines were rebuilt after the war and still carry freight across routes where partisan bombs once exploded nightly. Memorials mark locations where villages stood before German reprisals burned them. Museums preserve improvised detonators and demolition charges that partisan units manufactured from farm chemicals. These artifacts tell a story about the nature of resistance and the price of survival. In Moscow's Central Museum of the Great Patriotic War, a map displays rail war operations with red marks showing each demolition site. The marks cover the map so densely that underlying geography is barely visible. This visualization captures the campaign's essence: systematic, coordinated destruction on a scale that rewrote expectations of what guerrilla forces could achieve. Every red mark represented a calculated violation of international law, undertaken by ordinary people who chose survival over legality. They built a weapon from railway infrastructure and used it to break an empire. That weapon was banned, and they used it anyway, because sometimes breaking rules is the only way to live. The legacy of rail war extended far beyond its immediate military impact. Soviet military doctrine after the war incorporated partisan warfare as a fundamental component of defense strategy. The General Staff established specialized training programs for partisan operations, assuming that any future war with NATO would require guerrilla resistance in occupied territories. Officers studied rail war as a model for asymmetric warfare against technologically superior opponents. The lessons learned in Belarus forests became doctrine taught in Soviet military academies for 40 years. Western intelligence services also studied rail war intensively. CIA analysts in the 1950s produced classified reports examining how partisan forces achieved strategic effects with minimal resources. These reports influenced American counterinsurgency doctrine during the Vietnam War, though Americans found themselves on the receiving end of similar tactics. Vietnamese forces used railway sabotage extensively, applying techniques pioneered by Soviet partisans. The iron law of warfare proved itself again. Any tactic that works will be copied, refined, and used against its originators. The personal testimonies of rail war participants reveal complexities that statistics cannot capture. Mikhail Prudnikov was a 16-year-old collective farm worker when German forces occupied his region in 1941. He watched Wehrmacht soldiers hang his uncle for refusing to reveal partisan locations. Mikhail joined a partisan brigade the next day, lying about his age to be accepted. His first mission was railway sabotage in October 1943, part of the second wave of rail war operations. He described the experience decades later in an oral history interview: the terror of approaching German-guarded rail lines, the meticulous work of placing charges while listening for patrols, the sprint back to forest safety, the distant explosion that confirmed success. He said the fear never diminished, but purpose overcame fear. Every rail section destroyed was revenge for his uncle. Mikhail's brigade conducted 47 successful rail demolitions during 1943 to near 44. They lost 32 fighters to German security forces, a casualty rate exceeding 60%. Mikhail survived through a combination of skill, luck, and the protection of more experienced partisans who taught him to think like prey. He learned to move through forests leaving no trace, to read German patrol patterns, to distinguish between sounds that meant safety and sounds that meant death. These skills kept him alive when bolder comrades died. He carried psychological scars for decades, nightmares about explosions, startle responses to unexpected noises, survivor's guilt about living when so many friends died. He never regretted his choice to fight. The technical evolution of partisan demolition methods deserves deeper examination. Early rail war operations used crude charges that damaged but didn't completely destroy rail sections. German repair crews could fix these quickly. Partisan demolition teams learned through trial and error to place charges more effectively. They discovered that angled placement beneath rail joints maximized damage. They learned that dual charges, one on each rail, prevented Germans from simply replacing a single damaged rail section. They developed delayed action fuses that allowed multiple charges to detonate sequentially, preventing German bomb disposal teams from defusing unexploded devices. The most sophisticated technique involved calculating explosive quantities precisely. Too little explosive failed to sever the rail completely. Too much explosive wasted scarce materials. Starinov's training manuals provided formulas for calculating optimal charge sizes based on rail thickness and steel grade. But many partisans lacked mathematical training to apply these formulas. So partisan engineers developed simpler rules of thumb: 1 kilogram of homemade explosive per 10 centimeters of rail width. Double the charge if attacking hardened steel rails. These simplified guidelines weren't as precise as Starinov's calculations, but they were adequate and accessible to fighters with minimal education. The improvised explosive manufacturing process was dangerous beyond description. Ammonium nitrate fertilizer had to be purified through a process that involved heating and crystallization. The process occasionally exploded, killing partisan chemists. The explosive compound was hygroscopic, absorbing moisture from air and becoming unstable. Partisan units stored explosives in sealed containers buried underground, but moisture still infiltrated. Several partisan bases suffered catastrophic explosions when stored explosives detonated accidentally. These incidents killed dozens and revealed partisan locations to German forces. The risks were accepted as necessary costs of resistance. German countermeasures evolved as rail war continued. Wehrmacht security forces developed rapid rail repair techniques that reduced reconstruction time from 12 hours to 6 hours per damaged section. They pre-positioned repair materials at vulnerable points, allowing crews to begin work immediately after attacks. They established fortified repair bases where damaged rail sections could be replaced using prefabricated track segments. These innovations reduced partisan effectiveness, but never eliminated the threat. Partisans simply attacked more frequently, overwhelming repair capacity through volume rather than sophistication. The psychological warfare dimension of rail war deserves special attention. Soviet partisan headquarters used propaganda extensively to amplify the campaign's impact beyond physical destruction. Leaflets were distributed in German-occupied cities, claiming partisan forces numbered in the millions and controlled vast territories. Radio broadcasts in German described fictional partisan victories and exaggerated German casualties. False intelligence was leaked, suggesting that partisan forces possessed heavy weapons, including tanks and artillery. None of this was true, but German commanders believed it because their own experience confirmed that partisans were far more capable than initial assessments suggested. The propaganda affected German morale profoundly. Wehrmacht soldiers in rear area positions lived in constant fear of partisan attacks. Every Russian civilian was a potential threat. Every forest concealed possible ambush sites. The psychological toll manifested in breakdown rates that exceeded frontline combat units. German military psychiatrists documented cases of soldiers refusing to leave fortified positions, developing paranoid delusions about partisan infiltration, and requesting transfers to the front line where at least the enemy was visible. The invisible war destroyed men without firing shots. Soviet civilians caught between partisan operations and German occupation faced impossible choices. Collaborating with Germans offered immediate survival, but guaranteed execution if partisans discovered the betrayal. Supporting partisans invited German reprisals that often meant death for entire families. Remaining neutral was impossible because both sides demanded cooperation. Many civilians tried to navigate this lethal landscape by providing minimal cooperation to whichever force controlled their immediate area, switching allegiance as power shifted. This pragmatic survival strategy worked until it didn't, ending in execution when either side decided the civilian had betrayed them. The moral ambiguity of these situations challenges simplistic narratives about resistance and collaboration. A peasant who informed German forces about partisan movements might have been saving his children from reprisal execution. A woman who cooked for partisan units might have been forced into service under threat of violence. The categories of hero and traitor became meaningless when survival required cooperation with multiple hostile forces. Rail war occurred in this morally compromised space where traditional ethical frameworks offered no guidance. The post-war fate of partisan fighters varied dramatically. Heroes of the Soviet Union received medals, pensions, and social prestige. But many partisans faced suspicion from Stalin's security services. Had they collaborated with Germans before joining partisans? Had they committed unauthorized actions against Soviet citizens? Thousands of former partisans were interrogated by NKVD, and substantial numbers were imprisoned or executed for alleged crimes during the occupation. The suspicion was particularly acute for partisans who had operated independently before Moscow established control over the partisan movement. Stalin's paranoia extended even to those who had fought for Soviet survival. The economic impact of rail war extended decades beyond the war's end. Destroyed railways required complete reconstruction, consuming resources the Soviet Union desperately needed for post-war recovery. Some sections were never properly rebuilt, remaining as single-track lines instead of the double-track systems that existed before the war. The destruction's economic cost probably exceeded several billion rubles in 1940s currency, equivalent to tens of billions in modern terms. This was the price the Soviet Union paid for partisan warfare. Strategic military advantage in exchange for massive infrastructure damage that retarded economic recovery. German military analysts after the war conducted extensive reviews of partisan warfare operations. The consensus was that Wehrmacht had no effective counter to coordinated guerrilla campaigns in occupied territory. German forces were too dispersed, partisan-controlled areas too vast, and civilian populations too hostile. The only possible countermeasure would have been withdrawal from occupied Soviet territory, which was strategically unacceptable. German military theorists concluded that occupying hostile territory with insufficient troops while simultaneously fighting a conventional war was inherently unsustainable. Rail war proved this theorem with brutal efficiency. The influence of rail war on post-war conflicts was profound and multifaceted. Chinese communist forces studied Soviet partisan tactics during their civil war against nationalists. Vietnamese revolutionaries adapted rail war techniques for their campaign against French colonial forces. Afghan mujahideen in the 1980s used similar railway sabotage methods against Soviet forces, turning the tactics against their originators. Every successful guerrilla campaign since 1945 has incorporated elements pioneered during rail war, coordinated attacks on infrastructure, improvised explosives from commercial materials, and propaganda to amplify physical destruction's psychological impact. The technological advances that made modern counterinsurgency possible were developed partly in response to rail war's success. Helicopter mobility, night vision equipment, electronic surveillance, and precision-guided munitions all emerged from military requirements to combat guerrilla forces in difficult terrain. The arms race between insurgents and counterinsurgents continues today, with each innovation prompting counter-innovations. Rail war was an early chapter in this ongoing competition, demonstrating that technological superiority doesn't guarantee victory when the enemy refuses to fight conventionally. The ethical questions raised by rail war remain unresolved. Was it justified to violate international law when facing an enemy that routinely committed war crimes? Did Soviet commanders have the right to expose civilians to reprisals in service of military objectives? Should partisan fighters who killed German railway workers, many of whom were conscripts with no combat role, be considered warriors or murderers? These questions don't have comfortable answers. They force confrontation with the reality that total war obliterates moral certainties and leaves only choices between different categories of evil. The survivors of rail war carried their experiences into the post-war world. Klavdia Shulzhenko taught school for 40 years, never speaking publicly about her time as a partisan demolition specialist. Mikhail Prudnikov became a railway engineer, spending his career repairing the infrastructure he had once destroyed. Countless others returned to farming, factory work, and ordinary lives. They rarely discussed their wartime experiences because what they had done and seen didn't fit peacefully into normal society. The skills learned in partisan warfare, how to kill efficiently and destroy systematically, were useless and disturbing in peacetime. Most veterans locked those memories away and focused on building the future. But the memories never truly disappeared. In quiet moments, former partisans remembered the weight of explosive packs on night marches, the acrid smell of detonation fumes, the distant scream of derailing trains, the faces of comrades who didn't survive. These memories shaped their understanding of what humans could endure and what they could become when pushed to extremes. They knew, in ways that others couldn't understand, that civilization was a thin veneer over capacities for violence that surprised everyone who discovered them. The final assessment of rail war must acknowledge both its strategic success and its human cost. The campaign achieved its military objectives, crippling German logistics and contributing significantly to Wehrmacht defeat. It demonstrated that guerrilla forces operating with coordination and clear objectives could achieve strategic effects comparable to conventional military operations. But these achievements came at a price measured in hundreds of thousands of lives, destroyed communities, and psychological trauma that echoed through generations. Rail war was simultaneously a triumph of resistance and a tragedy of total war. Both truths coexist, and neither cancels the other. The forests of Belarus still hide remnants of rail war, unexploded ordnance discovered by farmers decades after the war, rusted rail sections bearing scars from partisan explosives, unmarked graves where German reprisal victims lie. These physical traces are fading as time passes, but the historical lessons remain vital. Rail war taught that occupied populations cannot be controlled if they choose resistance over survival. It taught that conventional military superiority means little when the enemy refuses conventional combat. And it taught that sometimes breaking rules is the only path to victory, though that path leads through moral territory where clean hands are impossible and good choices don't exist.